Hey everyone, tonight's topic is, well, a little strange. We're heading back to a time before modern medicine, before laboratories, microscopes, or even soap that actually worked. A time when people tried to understand life using barley seeds, wine, onions, and a whole lot of superstition. Yes, tonight, we're exploring the weirdest pregnancy tests in medieval history, and a few other oddities you probably weren't taught in school. Forget everything you know about sleek hospitals or home test kits. Back then, your doctor might have been a midwife with a handful of wheat, a candle, and a prayer. So, before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this quiet corner of history. And as always, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this little community come together from every corner of the world, drifting off to sleep, one strange story at a time. Now, dim the lights, maybe light a candle, or turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get comfortable, and let's step quietly into a world where medicine met magic, and where a single sprouting seed might have decided the fate of a family. The weirdest pregnancy tests in medieval history. The seeds of belief. You can imagine the year being somewhere around 1350, long before hospitals as we know them existed, before microscopes, before anyone could name a hormone or draw a chemical diagram. In a small thatched cottage near the edge of a walled town, a midwife leaned over a wooden table lit by a single tallow candle. Before her sat a clay bowl filled with wheat and barley seeds, and beside it, a small pot that would soon contain something far more personal, a sample of urine from a nervous young woman who suspected she might be with child. This, strangely enough, was one of the most trusted pregnancy tests in medieval Europe. The practice was simple, though not particularly pleasant. A woman's urine was poured over the seeds, and both were left to sit for several days. If the seeds sprouted quickly, she was declared pregnant. If they failed to grow, the diagnosis was negative. Some midwives swore they could even tell the gender of the unborn child based on which seeds sprouted first: barley for a boy, wheat for a girl. It may sound absurd now, but this method had deep symbolic logic to medieval minds. Fertility, in every form, was associated with the earth's ability to sprout life. To them, a woman's body and the soil shared the same essence. Both could bring forth new growth. And so, a test that linked the two seemed perfectly natural. The origins of this idea go back even further, long before medieval Europe, all the way to ancient Egypt. Papyrus texts from around 1350 BCE describe nearly the exact same ritual, with Egyptian women urinating on barley and emmer wheat to divine their condition. The medieval version, like so many other pieces of medical wisdom, was likely borrowed from these ancient sources and filtered through the writings of Greek and Arabic scholars before finding its way into the hands of medieval midwives. But of course, this was only one of many strange and creative tests. In the bustling university towns of Salerno or Montpellier, centers of medieval medicine, male physicians tried to systematize such folk knowledge into learned science. They read Latin translations of Galen and Hippocrates, believing that the body was governed by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, they thought, arose from imbalances between them. Pregnancy, too, was interpreted through this lens, not as a biological event, but as a transformation of humoral balance. According to their theory, when a woman conceived, her body retained vital moisture instead of expelling it. Therefore, her urine would be thicker, cloudier, and heavier, qualities that could supposedly be detected by sight, smell, or even taste. Yes, taste. Some medical texts from the 14th century describe physicians dipping a small piece of cloth into the patient's urine, drying it, and then tasting it to determine its sweetness or bitterness. Sweet urine, they believed, indicated an abundance of life-giving humors, possibly pregnancy. Of course, such tests were not without danger, as later centuries would learn when diagnosing diabetes in similar ways. But in the medieval world, this was considered sophisticated empirical observation. If you imagine a medieval apothecary's shop filled with the scents of herbs, vinegar, and candle wax, you can almost picture the learned physician consulting his manuscripts. He would wear long robes, perhaps with a hood, and on his desk lay the Trotula, a famous compendium of women's medicine from the 12th century, attributed to a female physician from Salerno named Trotta. The Trotula offered detailed instructions for diagnosing female ailments, including pregnancy. It suggested that a woman's urine should be clear and pale if she is barren, but if she be with child, it is thick and cloudy, and upon standing, a small white cloud will rise to the top. Another method involved placing a drop of urine in water and observing whether it sank or spread, a primitive but earnest attempt to interpret bodily signs. Even the sense of smell came into play. One physician advised holding a piece of metal heated in fire near the urine and noting the odor released. A sweet and earthy scent was a good omen. A sharp or sulfurous smell indicated illness or barrenness. In a world without laboratories, the human senses were the instruments of diagnosis. Outside the towns, far from the Latin-speaking physicians, midwives and village healers practiced their own forms of wisdom. Their knowledge was passed not through books, but through apprenticeship and oral tradition. They relied on observation, intuition, and superstition in equal measure. Some believed that pregnancy could be detected through dreams. If a woman dreamed of water, fish, or full moons, it meant fertility. If she dreamed of fire or broken pottery, it was a bad sign. Others used charms or incantations, whispering prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, who was said to have escaped from the belly of a dragon, a powerful metaphor for delivery. It's easy for us to dismiss such methods as nonsense, but they served an important purpose in a world with limited knowledge and great uncertainty. For many women, these rituals were moments of communal reassurance. They allowed older women to comfort younger ones, to share stories and wisdom passed down through generations. The act of performing a test, however unscientific, created the illusion of control in a life full of unpredictability. Pregnancy in medieval times was both a sacred and dangerous condition. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women, and infants rarely survived their first year. A positive pregnancy test was not necessarily a cause for celebration. It was the beginning of a long period of prayer, anxiety, and preparation. A woman who suspected she was with child would begin altering her habits. She might eat certain foods believed to strengthen the womb, such as almonds, honey, or soft cheese. She would avoid sharp smells, loud noises, and eclipses, the last of which were thought to disturb unborn children. Some carried amulets made from herbs like rue or mugwort, believed to protect against miscarriage. The Church, meanwhile, viewed pregnancy through a moral lens. A legitimate pregnancy within marriage was a divine blessing. Outside of marriage, it was a source of shame and punishment. The distinction shaped how, and whether, a woman sought help. Poor unmarried women often hid their condition until it was impossible to conceal, relying on whispered consultations with sympathetic midwives rather than doctors or priests. In noble households, pregnancy had political implications. The ability to produce heirs determined the survival of dynasties. Queens and duchesses were watched closely for signs. A missed period, a craving, or even a change in mood could spark gossip. Courtiers analyzed every gesture, every fainting spell, as potential evidence of conception. For these women, pregnancy tests were matters of state. In 15th century France, royal physicians sometimes examined the urine of queens in secret to confirm or deny rumors of succession. The results could decide wars, alliances, and inheritances. A false positive might raise hope too early. A false negative could cause diplomatic chaos. Even so, the accuracy of these tests was laughable by modern standards. The seed test, when studied in modern times, shows about 70% accuracy. Not bad, considering the primitive conditions. The urine's hormonal changes could indeed promote sprouting due to elevated estrogen levels. So, perhaps medieval women were not entirely wrong. In the quiet of that candlelit cottage, the midwife from our opening scene might have watched the tiny seeds for several days, checking them each morning with careful eyes. Maybe she prayed over them, or whispered blessings as she did her work. The anxious woman might have visited daily, pretending to bring bread or milk, desperate for a sign of life. When the first green shoots finally appeared, the midwife might have smiled gently and said, "The barley has woken. You will have a son." It wasn't science, but it was hope. And hope was a kind of medicine too. Over the centuries, these ancient methods gradually gave way to more systematic observation. By the 16th and 17th centuries, physicians like Paracelsus and Van Helmont began to look at bodily fluids not just symbolically but chemically. They attempted to distill urine, to analyze it for essences, and to classify its types in elaborate charts. Their goal was still rooted in the same idea, that truth about the body could be seen, smelled, and tasted, but the tools were growing more refined. Yet for most women, especially those in rural villages, little changed. The old methods persisted well into the 18th century. Seeds, dreams, and prayers remained their only diagnostic tools. If you close your eyes and listen, you can almost hear the slow drip of time, centuries of quiet lives, of women waiting and wondering, of candles burning down beside bowls of grain. And as strange as it seems, those little bowls of sprouting wheat were more than just folk superstition. They were an early glimpse of something modern, the desire to know, to predict, to measure life through observation. The same impulse that led a medieval midwife to watch seeds grow would, hundreds of years later, lead scientists to create the first chemical pregnancy test in the 20th century, still based on detecting hormones in urine. From seeds to science, the line is longer than we might think. But the story doesn't end there, because not all medieval pregnancy tests involved plants. Some were far more unsettling, and some bordered on the grotesque. Of urine, onions, and unsettling remedies. By the time dawn broke over the thatched rooftops of medieval towns, the narrow lanes would already hum with quiet activity. The baker's oven smoked, hens scratched near dung heaps, and a few women, wrapped in wool shawls, walked briskly to the local well. Among them might be a midwife, carrying a small bundle of linen and herbs, and perhaps, discreetly tucked away in her satchel, a pewter bowl. Inside that bowl, a small bottle of cloudy, golden liquid, urine, the essential ingredient for diagnosis. In the Middle Ages, urine was more than waste. It was information, a mirror to the hidden workings of the body. The belief that all diseases and conditions could be detected through it was nearly universal among medieval physicians. This practice, called uroscopy, was the cornerstone of medieval medical diagnosis. A doctor would hold a flask of urine up to the light, turning it gently, noting the color, consistency, and even the bubbles that clung to the sides. Illustrations in medical manuscripts showed physicians peering intently at glass flasks, the so-called medulla, arranged in neat rows by hue. Pale yellow for healthy, deep orange for feverish, blackish brown for deadly. In truth, these color charts were less scientific than poetic. They reflected the medieval tendency to connect the human body to the cosmic order. Pale colors were associated with air and clarity, dark ones with earth and corruption. Pregnancy, according to some treatises, made the urine appear whitish gold, like the dawn before sunrise. But while university-trained doctors interpreted urine through theory, village women often had their own ways of knowing. These were not written down in Latin, but lived in habit, whispers, and ritual. One of the strangest of these rituals involved a raw onion. According to a 15th century midwifery manual, if a woman suspected she was barren, she was told to insert a peeled onion, or sometimes a clove of garlic, into her womb overnight. If she could smell the onion on her breath by morning, her reproductive passages were considered open and healthy. If not, she was thought to be infertile. It was crude, uncomfortable, and completely unscientific, yet it reflected a rudimentary understanding of the body's internal connections. In fact, modern science confirms that sulfur compounds from garlic and onion can indeed be absorbed into the bloodstream and exhaled through the lungs. So perhaps, in a roundabout way, the old midwives were onto something. Still, one can imagine the discomfort of such a test, performed in secret by women desperate for children, guided only by candlelight and faith. In larger towns, more elaborate urine tests appeared, particularly among the learned physicians who served the nobility. They would not merely observe the urine, but perform curious experiments with it. Some sprinkled it with wine, vinegar, or powdered spices to see if it curdled. Others heated it over a flame to study the residue left behind. A few even mixed it with animal blood, believing that conception could somehow be mirrored in the mingling of fluids. One test, described in the 13th century Speculum Alchemiae, instructed physicians to place the woman's urine in a small copper basin and set it under the moon for a night. If in the morning a thin film formed on the surface, like oil on holy water, it signified pregnancy. If worms or creeping things appeared in it, the woman was ill or under the influence of witchcraft. The moon's involvement was no accident. Medieval thought bound women and the moon together through cycles and symbolism, both waxing and waning, both governing fertility and tides of blood. The same lunar calendar that guided sowing and harvest guided childbirth as well. Midwives planned deliveries, baths, and even diets according to its phases. To them, moonlight was not just light, it was influence. Of course, in noble households, these rituals took on even greater formality. The pregnancies of queens were national affairs. When Catherine of Aragon was Queen of England, her suspected pregnancies were matters of political intrigue. Before the days of modern verification, courtiers hung on rumors of her fullness, her fainting spells, and her physicians' quiet observations of her urine flasks. Imagine the tension in those candlelit rooms. A royal physician holding a flask before the fire, courtiers leaning forward, whispering about dynasties and heirs, the queen herself waiting behind embroidered curtains. A single incorrect assessment could mean disgrace or even war. Sometimes, false hopes were cruelly prolonged. If a queen's belly swelled from a tumor, dropsy, or other illness, she might still be declared pregnant by hopeful observers. This happened more than once in Tudor and Habsburg courts. The mixture of science, superstition, and politics made every test an act of theater as much as medicine. For the common woman, however, pregnancy was not about lineage but survival. Childbearing was both expected and perilous. A confirmed pregnancy meant months of preparation, sewing linens, storing herbs, and arranging for a midwife. Many of these preparations began as soon as any test, no matter how uncertain, hinted at conception. There were other curious tests besides seeds and onions. Some midwives claimed they could tell by the color of a woman's veins, particularly on her breast or lower eyelids. If the veins darkened to a bluish hue, they said it was a sure sign. Others observed the movement of a gold ring suspended on a string above the belly. If the ring swayed in circles, it meant a boy. If back and forth, a girl. But not all men of medicine were so poetic. Many viewed the female body as mysterious, even dangerous. In their writings, pregnancy often blurred with illness and menstruation with impurity. Some clerics even warned that women's bodies could corrupt holy objects or spoil crops during their unclean times. Within this worldview, the pregnancy test became more than diagnosis, it was a moral judgment. A barren woman was pitted, sometimes suspected of sin or witchcraft. A woman who conceived outside of marriage was condemned. And yet, in quiet corners of villages, midwives continued to offer compassion where the church offered shame. The midwife's role, often overlooked by historians, was vital. She was healer, counselor, and witness to countless private moments. While physicians wrote treatises in Latin, midwives lived their knowledge through touch and intuition. Their tests might have lacked science, but they carried centuries of experiential wisdom. A 14th century manuscript from the city of Rouen describes an old midwife who combined multiple methods to be sure of her judgment. She would first use the seed test, then examine the woman's eyes, pulse, and even the softness of her abdomen. Finally, she would whisper a prayer to the Virgin Mary and light a small candle, placing it on the hearth. If the flame burned steady, the child would live. If it flickered wildly, she advised caution. It's easy to imagine the quiet ritual. Two women alone, the smell of tallow and herbs, the faint sound of wind outside the shutters. In that silence, medicine and faith were one and the same. Meanwhile, in the universities of Bologna and Padua, male physicians began to dispute the midwives' methods. They wrote that pregnancy could only be diagnosed by the learned, for women were deceived by imagination and humors. One anonymous 15th century commentator went so far as to say that midwives' urine tests belonged to witchcraft more than to medicine. Yet despite their disdain, these same scholars often borrowed from midwives' knowledge, translating oral tradition into scholarly Latin and claiming it as their own. The boundary between folk and academic medicine was porous. A practice might be mocked in one century and redescribed as empirical study in the next. Such was the strange progress of medieval science: suspicion, imitation, and reinvention. Some pregnancy tests were even darker. A few medical texts proposed examining the urine for signs of corruption, which led to experiments that now seem grotesque. One involved mixing the woman's urine with wine and observing whether it produced a sediment like curdled milk. If it did, conception was declared certain. Another instructed the physician to mix urine with the milk of another woman. If it coagulated, pregnancy was confirmed. There are even accounts of alchemists attempting to distill urine to capture the spirit of life within it, heating it slowly until vapors rose. They believed that if the vapors formed certain patterns or smells, they could foretell pregnancy, disease, or death. These experiments were less about accuracy than symbolism. In a world without microscopes, the body was a mystery of elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and urine, steaming and evaporating under flame, seemed to bridge them all. The obsession with bodily fluids extended beyond urine. Some midwives claimed they could predict conception by watching how a drop of a woman's blood interacted with oil. If the drops spread and mixed evenly, she was thought fertile. If it separated or sank, barren. Others relied on smell alone. A faint sweetness, they said, meant pregnancy, a sour or musky odor otherwise. It is unsettling to imagine the intimacy of such examinations, performed in cold stone rooms lit by firelight, where medicine blurred with superstition and faith. By the late medieval period, these tests began to mingle with astrology. Physicians drew horoscopes not only for births, but for conceptions. They charted the positions of planets and stars to determine whether a pregnancy was viable or doomed. Jupiter and Venus in favorable alignment meant fertility. Saturn or Mars brought misfortune. The heavens were seen as extensions of the body, another set of signs to read. In many ways, the medieval pregnancy test was not just about detecting life, but interpreting meaning. It was less a question of yes or no than of fate, morality, and divine will. Yet, beneath all the ritual and symbolism, something human and universal persisted: the fear and hope that come with the possibility of new life. Whether through barley sprouting or urine steaming under moonlight, these tests reflected an age-old desire to find certainty in the uncertain. A medieval woman, holding her breath as she watched seeds grow or waited for the midwife's verdict, was not so different from someone today staring at a thin blue line on a modern test strip. The technology has changed, but the quiet anticipation, that mixture of dread, hope, and awe, remains timeless. Still, as the 15th century turned toward the Renaissance, curiosity deepened. The seeds and onions began to feel like relics of the past, and a new generation of physicians sought more measurable signs. They began dissecting animals, observing conception firsthand, and theorizing about the embryo. Alchemists pursued the mysterious quintessence of life within bodily fluids, inching ever closer to chemistry. The strange medieval tests were not forgotten, only transformed. But among them all, one stands apart for its eerie symbolism, a test involving wine, flame, and the whisper of death. It was said to reveal not only whether a woman was pregnant, but whether her unborn child would live or die. The wine of life and the breath of death. The air inside a medieval apothecary was thick with the scent of dried herbs, beeswax, and vinegar. Clay jars lined the walls, each labeled with Latin inscriptions: Rosmarinus, Salvia, Mandragora. In the center of the room stood a heavy wooden table darkened by age and by centuries of spills and scorch marks. Upon it rested a small copper basin, a candle, and a flask of deep red wine. This was no celebration. It was an experiment, one that sought to read the secret of life through the reaction of urine and wine. The test was simple but sinister in tone. A physician would mix equal parts of a woman's urine and wine in the basin, stir gently, and leave it overnight. If by morning the liquid appeared clear and unchanged, the woman was said to be pregnant. But if the mixture turned cloudy, developed a film, or emitted an unpleasant odor, the prognosis was grim. Some texts even claimed that if bubbles formed, the child would not live. To modern eyes, this might seem like a random superstition, but there was method in the madness. Alcohol, though not understood chemically, was recognized as a powerful solvent. The medieval physician reasoned that wine could reveal the hidden nature of the urine, its humors, vapors, and vital spirits. The clarity of the mixture was a metaphor for the harmony of the body, the unity of mother and child. Cloudiness meant corruption, a disturbance in that harmony. It was, in essence, a diagnosis not only of pregnancy, but of fate itself. This belief in reading fate through matter was deeply medieval. Every material substance, from metals to herbs, was thought to carry symbolic meaning. Gold signified purity, lead, melancholy, wine, vitality. And so, when wine met urine, two essences, life and body, were believed to commune. One 14th century treatise, De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women, describes this test with remarkable seriousness. The author writes that in the wine resides the heat of the sun, and in the urine the moisture of the moon. If the two blend harmoniously, it is a sign of conception, for man and woman are reconciled within her. To modern ears, that sounds poetic rather than medical, but in the medieval mind, it was both. The cosmos and the body mirrored each other. What happened in the heavens was echoed in flesh and blood. A pregnancy test was not simply a bodily inquiry. It was a cosmic reading. It's tempting to laugh at such methods, but they reveal an important truth about the medieval worldview. Knowledge was holistic. There was no hard line between science, superstition, and spirituality. A physician could dissect a cadaver by day and cast a horoscope by night without contradiction. The same hands that mixed wine and urine might also bless the mixture with a whispered prayer. For them, knowing meant observing, not only the body, but its place in the order of the world. Every scent, color, and texture was a clue. Even dreams were diagnostic tools. Some of these tests, however, went beyond symbolic meaning into the territory of the macabre. A few manuscripts describe an unsettling practice, the breath test. It was said that if a woman's breath had a particular sweetness, a warm, faintly floral odor, she was with child. But if her breath smelled sour or metallic, she was not. Physicians attributed this to the rising of vapors from the womb. One Italian doctor, writing around 1470, claimed to have refined this method by heating a silver spoon and holding it beneath a woman's breath. If the spoon developed a faint golden sheen, she was pregnant. If it tarnished or blackened, she was not. The symbolism was clear, the breath of life revealing the state of the womb, silver mirroring the soul. Yet one cannot help but imagine the discomfort of the patient, sitting nervously as her physician leaned close enough to inhale her breath in the flickering light. These experiments, for all their strangeness, hint at an early form of empirical thinking. The physicians were trying, however crudely, to test observable properties, reactions, colors, smells, rather than relying solely on omens or divine signs. The problem was not the desire for evidence, but the lack of understanding of what that evidence meant. They saw patterns everywhere, because in a pre-scientific world, patterns were the only proof available. And yet, these methods persisted for centuries because, occasionally, they appeared to work. A clear mixture here, a sprouted seed there, enough coincidences to sustain belief. But perhaps the most curious test of all, and the most disturbing, was known as the lead test. Mentioned briefly in a few obscure manuscripts, it involved dropping a small piece of molten lead into the woman's urine. The lead would solidify into irregular shapes, and the physician would interpret those shapes as signs. Smooth, rounded forms suggested pregnancy. Jagged or broken ones signified illness or infertility. It sounds more like fortune-telling than diagnosis, and indeed, it was. The molten metal was believed to capture the imprint of the woman's life force as it cooled. In a world where reading the future through melted wax or molten tin was common at New Year's feasts, this medical adaptation seemed natural. The connection between heat, transformation, and life was powerful in medieval thought. To them, metal and flesh were not so different. Both were subject to the alchemy of nature. The lead test, like so many others, blended magic and medicine seamlessly. Not all strange tests were so ritualized. Some were practical, even intuitive. Midwives often judged pregnancy simply by the pulse. They placed their fingers lightly on the woman's wrist and watched her eyes. If the pulse leaps with joy when the child is spoken of, wrote one, then she is surely pregnant. It's unscientific, yes, but it reflects a certain wisdom about emotion and physiology. The quickening of the heart, the subtle tension in the body, these were real, observable signs. And sometimes, those who trusted instinct were closer to truth than those who trusted flasks. By the late 15th century, Europe was changing. Printing presses spread books faster than ever before, and medical ideas traveled with them. Manuals like The Rose Garden of Pregnant Women and The Midwives' Secrets compiled centuries of lore. Some repeated the seed test, the wine test, and the onion test word for word. Others began to challenge them, hinting that the causes of pregnancy lay not in humors or the moon, but in physical processes, something hidden in the seed of man. These were the first flickers of modern embryology, but they remained entangled with superstition for a long time. Even as knowledge advanced, old practices lingered. In remote villages, women still turned to midwives rather than doctors. They still whispered over bowls of wheat, still watched the moon, still hoped that a clear bowl of urine mixed with wine meant a safe future. For them, it was never only about medicine. It was about comfort. The rituals gave meaning to uncertainty, structure to fear. The same could be said for countless human customs across history, rituals that may not cure but console. If you imagine now that same midwife from section 1, the one who washed barley sprout in a clay bowl, she might have learned, in her old age, a new method brought from the city, the wine test. Her daughter, or perhaps her apprentice, might have carried a flask of red wine back from the market, excited by this latest wisdom. They might have tried it together, by firelight, stirring carefully, whispering the old prayers out of habit even as they tried the new science. When the mixture stayed clear, they might have smiled, not because they understood chemistry, but because they understood relief. Science, at its core, begins in moments like these, the quiet merging of curiosity and care. The story of medieval pregnancy tests is, then, more than a tale of odd rituals. It's a story about how humans sought knowledge long before knowledge could explain itself. It's about women's bodies being interpreted through layers of myth, fear, and fascination, yet also through genuine attempts at understanding. And it's a reminder that history often hides in the ordinary. In a bowl of seeds, a drop of wine, a candle flame, small, humble things that once held the weight of hope. Modern science would eventually validate some of these old intuitions. The ancient seed test, for example, has been shown to work in a surprising number of cases because certain hormones in pregnant urine, estrogens, can indeed stimulate seed germination. Of course, medieval people could never have known why it worked, only that it sometimes did. In that sense, they were not fools but observers, people doing their best to understand nature with the tools available. By the dawn of the modern age, the alchemist's dream of revealing hidden truths through transformation would find new form in chemistry and biology. And centuries later, the color change in a small test strip would echo the same ritual once performed beside a candle and a bowl of grain. The tools changed. The longing to know did not. The wine test, the onion test, the seed test. They may seem primitive now, but they speak to something profound about human history, the bridge between ignorance and inquiry. Every strange test was a step, however small, toward the light of understanding. But even as medical science advanced, one question lingered, one that medieval people never stopped asking, and that perhaps we still ask in quieter ways today. If life begins in mystery, can any test, no matter how clever, truly measure hope? From seeds to science, the long road to knowing. In the cool hush of a medieval dawn, Long before the church bells began their first toll, a woman stood alone at her window, staring over the misty thatched roofs of her village. On the wooden table beside her sat a small clay bowl. Inside it, barley seeds had begun to sprout, tiny green shoots unfurling toward the faint gray light. She had checked them every morning for nearly a week, whispering prayers to Saint Margaret as she did so. For her, and countless women like her, that bowl was more than a test. It was a vessel of hope, fear, and future. It contained the possibility of new life in a world where life was fragile and short. What began as a simple act, pouring urine onto seeds, had carried through centuries, from the banks of the Nile to the candlelit cottages of medieval Europe. And in that persistence lies a truth about history. Even the strangest practices often endure because they fulfill a deeply human need, the need to know. By the late Middle Ages, Europe had entered an age of uneasy transition. The humors still ruled medical theory, but new whispers of experimentation and observation were spreading. The alchemist laboratories, once the realm of mystery and mysticism, were beginning to evolve into the first proto-scientific workshops. In these rooms, lit by fire, cluttered with glass flasks, filled with the heavy smell of sulfur and smoke, men in long robes tried to capture life's secrets through distillation, condensation, and calculation. Some believed that by separating the elements of urine, blood, or saliva, they could find the essence of vitality itself, the divine spark that animated the body. To them, pregnancy was the ultimate alchemical miracle, the visible proof that matter could transform itself into life. And so, even as they scoffed at the folk practices of midwives, they were, in their own way, chasing the same truth. One of the most influential thinkers of this changing age was Paracelsus, the 16th century physician, alchemist, and philosopher who defied the old schools of Galen. He believed that the body was not governed by humors but by chemical reactions, and that disease arose from imbalances of substances, not spirits. Paracelsus was fascinated by the hidden power of bodily fluids. He believed that every human excretion carried a signature of the soul. Though he rejected the onion and seed tests, he performed countless experiments with urine, claiming that he could use it to detect pregnancy, disease, and even temperament. His ideas paved the way for what would later become iatrochemistry, the attempt to understand health and illness through chemistry rather than philosophy. The shift was subtle but profound. Knowledge was moving from symbol to substance, from metaphor to measurement. Yet even Paracelsus, revolutionary as he was, still described conception in mystical terms, as the joining of elemental forces. To him, pregnancy remained a divine mystery clothed in matter. Science could describe it, but never fully explain it. For centuries after Paracelsus, the strange shadow of medieval medicine lingered. In rural Europe, especially, the old tests survived. Even as cities built universities and apothecaries refined their methods, the countryside remained slow to change. Midwives still performed the seed test well into the 18th century. In some villages, women were told to mix urine with wine or vinegar and watch for reaction. In others, they placed their urine under the full moon or over the household hearth, waiting for signs. There was something comforting in the ritual, something that no laboratory could replace. It allowed ordinary people to engage with the mysteries of their own bodies, to act instead of simply wait. And so, for centuries, the humble bowl of sprouting seeds remained the most accessible diagnostic tool available to women. That would begin to change only in the 19th century, when science, now separated from alchemy and theology, began to approach reproduction through the lens of biology. Microscopes revealed the existence of sperm and ovum, and later, the process of fertilization. The idea of life force gave way to cells, tissues, and hormones. But even then, the idea that urine contained clues to pregnancy persisted because it was true. In 1927, thousands of years after an Egyptian scribe first wrote of barley and emmer wheat, scientists rediscovered the principle behind it. Two German researchers, Selmar Askiam and Bernhard Zondek, developed a test that involved injecting a woman's urine into a female rabbit. If the rabbit's ovaries reacted, the woman was pregnant. It was called the Askiam-Zondek test, and though it sounds barbaric now, it worked, because human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, a hormone produced during pregnancy, causes specific physiological changes in animals. For the first time in history, pregnancy could be scientifically confirmed. But the irony was unmistakable. After centuries of rituals with seeds and onions, the truth had been hidden in the same place all along, in urine. The medieval midwives, in their own unschooled way, had been right. The discovery of HCG led to a cascade of innovation. By the 1960s, researchers developed laboratory assays that could detect the hormone directly, without involving animals. And in 1978, the first home pregnancy test was born, a small, plastic wand containing reagents that reacted visibly when HCG was present. It was, in essence, a modern version of the seed test, a ritual reduced to chemistry, a quiet act of waiting for signs to appear. Where once women watched seeds sprout in bowls of clay, now they watched for a colored line in the window of a small device. Both waited in silence, hearts pounding, lives poised on the edge of change. Looking back, the continuity is almost poetic. The journey from barley and urine to test strips and digital readouts is not a leap, but a slow unfolding, a chain of human curiosity stretching across millennia. In that sense, the medieval tests, however absurd they seem, belong to the same lineage of discovery that gave us modern medicine. They were clumsy beginnings of observation, experiments born of intuition rather than instruments. And sometimes, intuition is the seed of science. Still, it is important to remember that behind these experiments were people, women whose bodies were tested, doubted, and interpreted through centuries of male authority and superstition. The history of pregnancy testing is also the history of how society has treated women's knowledge. In the medieval world, women's understanding of their own bodies was often dismissed as witchcraft or folk nonsense. Yet, it was women, midwives, mothers, and healers, who preserved and passed down the practical wisdom of reproduction when universities excluded them. They may not have spoken Latin or written treatises, but they knew the rhythms of the body, the signs of life, the language of survival. Without their persistence, even the crude tests of antiquity might have been forgotten, and science might have taken longer to find its truth. The medieval pregnancy tests, strange as they were, reveal something tender about humanity, our endless need to bridge the gap between ignorance and understanding. We have always sought to interpret the hidden, the stirring of a seed, the shimmer of wine, the warmth of breath, as messages from the unknown. That need hasn't changed. Today's sleek, disposable test sticks are simply modern relics of the same longing that once made women bend over bowls of barley under flickering candlelight. The tools have become quieter, more sterile, more precise, but the moment remains deeply human. The anxious waiting, the hope, the fear, the whisper of a prayer, silent now, perhaps, but still there. Imagine the scene once more. A medieval woman alone in her cottage, the barley sprouting in her bowl. Outside, the wind moves through the reeds, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls the hour. She leans closer to the tiny green shoots, breath held, her life suspended in their fragile growth. She doesn't know it, but in that quiet act, she's participating in the dawn of science, in humanity's first attempt to read the secret language of life. 1,000 years later, another woman, sitting on the edge of a bathtub in a modern apartment, stares at a slim white stick and waits for a faint pink line to appear. The centuries between them collapse in an instant. Both are waiting for the same answer. History, in its grand sweep, often remembers kings, battles, and inventions. But perhaps it is in these small, private rituals, a bowl of seeds, a flask of wine, a whisper in the dark, that we glimpse the most enduring truth about who we are. For even in the most boring corners of history, humanity's quiet search for meaning never ceased. And sometimes, the weirdest stories are simply the most human ones.